His private arrangements secure the Wales family's future. I was entrusted to protect that decision, and I intend to do precisely that. Charles's final wish will stand.
Camilla had just finished speaking. The applause was still settling when she stepped off the low stage at the royal engagement, the kind of carefully staged afternoon appearance that the palace schedules to show continuity and calm. An aide intercepted her in the side corridor before she could reach the waiting car. The sealed red envelope was already in his hand. "Ma'am, this came directly from the Duke of Edinburgh's solicitors." The color shifted in her face the moment Edward's name was spoken. She took the envelope without a word, broke the seal, and began to read. The first lines stopped her. She read them again. Then she turned to the final page. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. "William knows about this?" The aide did not answer. Camilla looked back at the paper. Her hands began to shake. She tried to walk on, reached for the wall, and then her knees gave way. Staff moved in at once, forming a screen around her. A senior aide's voice cut through the corridor, sharp and urgent. "No photographs. Phones away. Now." It was already too late. Enough people had seen the Queen Consort collapse after receiving a letter from Prince Edward's lawyers. The question that would travel through the palace within the hour was the only one that mattered. What could Edward's solicitors possibly have put inside that envelope to reduce the Queen Consort to this? The answer began months earlier in the quiet of early 2026. Charles had been thinking more carefully about succession than he allowed anyone outside a very small circle to know. His health had forced the issue. He was not dying, not yet, but the reality of limited time had settled over him like a permanent weather system. He began reviewing the things that still belonged to him personally. Not the crown estate, not the official residences that would pass with the throne, the private ones, Burke Hall, certain jewelry inherited from his mother, private investment accounts, artworks and objects that had never been declared part of any official collection, family papers, items that carried emotional weight rather than constitutional status. He did not want those things to become weapons after he was gone. He did not want two households fighting over them in public or in private. So he made a decision, and he made it alone. He asked to see Edward. No Camilla, no William, just the two of them in a private room, the kind of meeting that leaves no official diary entry if the staff are careful enough. Charles spoke without drama. "When I am gone, there must be no argument about where the future lies." Edward listened. For the first time, he understood that his brother had already made a large decision, and that he, Edward, was being asked to protect it, rather than benefit from it. Charles did not give Edward the assets. He gave him the role of guardian. Edward was brought into a tightly restricted group of solicitors and advisors, who held sealed copies of the private instruments. Charles chose him precisely because Edward was not the principal beneficiary. That made him neutral. The instruction that accompanied the appointment was absolute. No amendment was to be accepted without Charles's direct written authorization. Edward accepted the duty. He said very little. He simply began to hold the papers. Camilla did not know the contents. She only began to notice the absences. Edward had met Charles without her knowledge. Private solicitors had been seen arriving and leaving through side entrances. William later had a separate meeting that was not listed on any shared household schedule. Certain inventories connected to Burke Hall were quietly updated. When one of her own aides asked the palace private secretary for clarification, the answer came back carefully worded and deliberately incomplete. It concerns His Majesty's personal arrangements. The word personal landed hard. In the language of the palace, it meant that Camilla's office had no automatic authority. The mystery began there. Burke Hall was the first concrete loss she felt. For decades, the house in Scotland had been central to the life she shared with Charles. She had assumed, as people who live inside institutions often assume, that long use created a kind of continuing right. When her household made a routine administrative inquiry about long-term plans for the property, the reply was short. Future management has already been determined. No name, no further detail, only the confirmation that a plan existed beyond her reach. That was the first real blow. She understood for the first time that something had been decided without her. She did not confront anyone directly. She used bureaucracy instead. Her household began sending polite, carefully phrased questions that sounded like ordinary housekeeping. Who would maintain Burke Hall in the longer term? Who controlled jewelry of historic significance once it left the sovereign's immediate possession? Should heritage objects remain accessible to the reigning household, even if privately owned? Could private arrangements that touched royal residences be independently reviewed for continuity? No one ever said the words, "Give them to Camilla." The goal was softer and more dangerous, to create enough legal ambiguity that the documents would have to be opened and re-examined. Edward recognized the pattern at once. When a formal request for an administrative review arrived, he refused it. A representative from Camilla's side tried the softer formulation. Her Majesty is merely requesting clarification. Edward's reply was flat. There is nothing to clarify. It was the first time Camilla understood that Edward was no longer standing on the edge of family disputes. He had been placed in the center of one, and he intended to stay there. She tried a different approach. She asked to speak with William. She framed the conversation as practical rather than personal. Burke Hall and certain pieces of jewelry carried historical weight, she said. It would be unwise to remove them entirely from the control of the reigning household. Continuity mattered. Stability mattered. William listened without understanding at first. Then Camilla said one sentence too many, a reference that only made sense if private dispositions already existed. William's expression changed. "What exactly has my father signed?" Camilla realized too late that she had revealed the existence of papers William himself had not fully seen. The conversation ended. William did not go to Charles. He went to Edward. Edward initially refused to discuss the documents. Confidentiality was the entire point of his role. William pressed the only argument that could reach him. "If my children are named in those papers, I have a right to know what someone is trying to change." Edward eventually showed him a limited portion of the arrangements. Not everything. Enough. Charles had not written the dispositions solely in favor of William and Catherine. He had written them in favor of the Wales family as a unit. George, Charlotte, Louis? The stakes shifted in that moment. This was no longer only a contest between Camilla and the next generation. It was a contest between Camilla and Charles's grandchildren. William's attitude hardened completely. The confrontation that followed was closed and deliberate. Camilla's side still spoke the language of national significance and proper management. William placed a copy of the relevant page on the table between them. "This is my father's decision for his grandchildren. You are not reviewing an asset. You are trying to rewrite his decision." Camilla answered that Charles might not have fully understood the implications when he signed. It was a serious mistake. William's voice stayed level. "Are you questioning the king's capacity to decide what happens to his own property?" The room went silent. Camilla was trapped. To say yes was dangerous. To say no removed the only remaining justification for any review. She did not concede. Her household tried one final legal angle. Certain jewelry that Elizabeth had left to Charles carried historic significance. Even if technically private, the argument ran, those pieces should remain available to future consorts during the current reign. Ownership could sit with Catherine on paper, while practical access stayed with Camilla now. William rejected the framing outright. Edward's solicitors began preparing the final response. Then Edward found the missing page. It was not a formal instrument. It was a handwritten note from Charles, kept in a separate sealed envelope inside the archive. Edward had known it existed and had hoped never to use it. The note was personal, but Camilla's final attempt left him no choice. The solicitors judged that the note proved intent beyond any possible reinterpretation. The words were direct. "William and Catherine are the future of this family. What remains mine must strengthen them and the children, not divide them after me." And the final sentence, "No one is to alter this arrangement on my behalf." Any claim that others were merely interpreting the king's intention died there. The jewelry inventory made the personal cost sharper still. Among the pieces Charles had inherited privately from Elizabeth were several that Camilla had quietly expected to continue using. They were not crown jewels, they were not state property, they were personal. Charles had directed them to the Wales household. The conflict was no longer only about houses and funds. It had become a symbolic rejection. The next woman in the direct line who would wear those pieces was Catherine. Camilla still believed she had one remaining door. She asked that the matter be taken to Charles himself. The answer that returned was the same one that had been given for weeks. The king had already given his written instruction. Camilla insisted. Then I want to hear it from him. The response was colder. There is nothing His Majesty has asked us to reconsider. She understood finally that proximity to Charles no longer gave her the power to reopen what he had closed. Edward decided the matter was finished. He instructed his solicitors to end all further discussion. No additional meetings, no negotiation, no review. They were to issue a final written confirmation and seal it. The confirmation was precise. Birkhall would pass under the management of the Wales household. The private jewelry Charles had inherited from Elizabeth would move to the same household. Residual private funds would follow the direct line. And the last line was absolute. No further internal review would be entertained. The red envelope was prepared with deliberate care. Edward's solicitors sealed it themselves, the thick cream paper stamped only with the discreet mark of their firm, and the single line of instruction that it was to be delivered by hand, without intermediary, at the first suitable moment after the engagement. No courier service, no palace messenger, just one trusted aide who understood that the contents were not for discussion. That is the document Camilla opened in the side corridor after the engagement. The applause from the main room still echoed faintly through the walls. The audience can now hear the words she read, line by line, as the color drained from her face. The first paragraph concerned Birkhall. The language was clinical, almost dry. Future management of the property had been determined in accordance with His Majesty's private dispositions and would pass under the direction of the Prince and Princess of Wales. Camilla stopped. She read the sentence twice. Her thumb pressed hard against the edge of the paper until the crease whitened. She turned the page. The second section dealt with the jewelry. Specific pieces inherited privately by Charles from Queen Elizabeth were listed by description rather than formal inventory number. The collection would transfer in full to the Wales household. No residual right of use was reserved for the current consort. Her hands began to shake. The paper rattled softly between her fingers. The third section addressed the residual private funds and accounts that had never formed part of any official crown holding. Those too were directed to the direct line. She reached the final sentence, and the words seemed to sit on the page longer than the rest. The arrangements in favor of the Prince and Princess of Wales and their children are final. No further internal review will be entertained. She asked again, almost to herself, the question that had formed the moment the envelope was placed in her hands. William knows. The aide answered this time, voice carefully neutral. Yes, ma'am. A longer pause followed. Camilla's eyes remained fixed on the last line. And Catherine? Yes. That was the last blow, the knowledge that both of them already knew, that the confirmation had reached Kensington before it reached her, removed the final illusion of control. Camilla's legs gave way. She reached for the wall, missed, and sank. Staff closed around her in practiced formation, forming a living screen that blocked the view from the far end of the corridor. A senior member of the household barked orders. Seal the corridor, move the queen consort into the nearest private room, every phone away, every camera covered. The official line that left the palace later that day said only that the queen consort had felt briefly unwell after a long engagement. The witnesses already knew better. Within the hour, the first rumor that traveled through the building was simple and lethal. The Queen collapsed after receiving a letter from Edward's lawyers. No one needed the full contents yet. The question alone was enough to set the palace whispering. William received the final confirmation at Kensington later the same afternoon. Catherine was with him in the private study. The papers arrived in an identical sealed envelope. He did not celebrate. He did not smile. He simply opened the pages, read them through once, then again more slowly, and laid them on the desk between them. Catherine watched his face rather than the documents. After a long silence, he spoke only one sentence. It should never have come to this. Victory, such as it was, carried a darker understanding. His father's wishes had required legal protection inside the family itself. The very fact that Edward's solicitors had been forced to issue a final, unchallengeable confirmation told William how close the arrangements had come to being reopened. An advisor asked Edward that evening whether the matter was now closed. Edward stood at the window of his study at Bagshot Park, looking out across the grounds that had once been the subject of a different dispute. His answer was measured and final. Legally, yes. He paused, the weight of the second half of the sentence already visible in his expression. As a family, no. After that day, the shape of the monarchy shifted in ways that would never appear in any official statement or court circular. At Buckingham Palace, the machinery continued without interruption. Camilla remained queen consort. The titles remained, the public appearances continued on schedule. The cars still arrived and departed with the same precision. Yet inside the private rooms, the atmosphere had changed. Staff, who had once moved freely between households, now measured their words. Loyalty had become a quieter, more careful thing. At Kensington, a different center of gravity had been confirmed. William, Catherine, George, Charlotte, and Louis now held not only the future of the crown, but the private assets Charles had chosen, deliberately and in writing, to place behind them. Burke Hall, the jewelry, the funds, the quiet assurance that what the king still controlled personally would strengthen the next generation, rather than become a source of division after him. Charles had not made a speech. He had not issued a public announcement. He had not summoned the family to a formal meeting to explain his reasoning. He had simply used the things that still belonged to him, things that were neither crown estate nor state property, to cast a quiet, irreversible vote for the future. The document spoke for him more clearly than any statement could have done. Camilla's real loss was not the house, or the jewelry, or the funds. She still held the title. She still appeared at the king's side at formal occasions. She still occupied the visible center of the public monarchy. The cameras still framed her as consort. But when Charles had been forced to decide where the things that were truly his would go after him, he had chosen William. He had chosen Catherine. He had chosen the 3 children. And he had placed Edward, steady, precise, and unbound by personal gain, between those arrangements and anyone who might try to change them. Camilla had spent decades moving toward the center of the institution, navigating its rules, its silences, and its long memory. The red envelope showed her something no title, no public role, and no proximity to the sovereign could alter. Charles had already decided where the monarchy went after him, and the path he chose did not run through her. That was why the color left her face in the corridor. That was why her hands shook as she turned the pages. That was why she reached for the wall and found only air. And that was why, in a passageway the palace tried and failed to seal off completely, the queen consort finally collapsed.